By 2024, Chinese state-owned or state-linked entities held operational stakes in over 95 ports across 53 countries, including berthing rights, terminal management, or equity ownership in facilities that sit directly astride every major choke point connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic. Malacca, Hormuz, Suez, the English Channel approaches, every corridor through which the global economy breathes. That number, 95, is the endpoint of something. The question that does not resolve easily is when the starting point actually was. The standard account begins in 2013, when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative in a speech in Astana, Kazakhstan. The logic goes, China saw an infrastructure gap across the developing world, deployed capital to fill it, and accumulated geopolitical leverage as a secondary benefit. The ports, in this reading, are the product of an investment strategy that happened to have strategic consequences. That framing was repeated widely enough and for long enough that it has become the default container for this entire subject. It starts the story in the wrong place. COSCO, China Ocean Shipping Company, the state enterprise that would become the operational backbone of this expansion, began its first overseas terminal acquisitions in 1997. The Piraeus container terminal in Greece, which later became the most cited example of Chinese port strategy in Europe, was not a Belt and Road acquisition. The initial lease agreement was signed in 2008, 5 years before Belt and Road existed as a named policy. By the time Xi gave that speech in Astana, COSCO already had established footholds in Antwerp, Singapore, Suez, and along the US West Coast. In 2004, China's State Council published a document titled The Medium and Long-Term Plan for Comprehensive Transportation Network Development. It received almost no Western coverage. It outlined, in bureaucratic language that read as technical planning rather than strategic declaration, a framework for developing what it called strategic maritime nodes, specific port locations identified by their proximity to international shipping lanes. The document named 23 locations. By 2015, Chinese entities had established operational presence in 19 of them. That document is where the sequence starts, not 2013, not 2008, 2004. The shipping corridors that matter in global trade are not uniformly distributed. The Strait of Malacca, which connects the Pacific and Indian Oceans between Malaysia and Indonesia, carries an estimated 40% of global trade by volume. The Bab el-Mandeb, the narrow passage at the southern end of the Red Sea connecting the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal route, carries roughly 10% of global oil shipments. Whoever can slow, monitor, or complicate passage through these corridors holds something more durable than a trade advantage. They hold a structural position in the architecture of the global economy itself. The 2004 document used the phrase strategic maritime nodes 9 times. Chinese port acquisitions that followed it were never framed that way publicly. They were announced as commercial investments, infrastructure partnerships, development finance. The gap between the internal language and the public language is not unusual in long-range planning. But it is a gap worth holding in mind as the sequence continues. Because the distance between those two framings, commercial investment versus strategic node, is exactly where the disagreement about what China built will eventually have to be settled. By 2008, the architecture had its first permanent European foothold. The 95 ports came later. But the map was already being drawn. The mechanism that built this network was not, at its core, a diplomatic one. It was a financial one. And the distinction matters more than coverage of this subject typically acknowledges. China's port expansion did not proceed primarily through government-to-government agreements, though those followed. It proceeded through a lending architecture that made the commercial logic of accepting Chinese capital almost irresistible to the countries being approached. And that is a different kind of leverage than the kind that shows up in foreign policy analysis. Here is how the structure worked. China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank, both state-owned, both operating under State Council guidance, extended infrastructure loans to developing economies at rates that undercut Western multilateral lenders. The World Bank's standard concessional rate, through its International Development Association window, sits around 1.25% over 25 to 40 years. Chinese Development Bank rates varied by project, but the more consequential variable was not the interest rate. It was what secured the loan. In multiple documented cases, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port being the most cited, the collateral was the infrastructure itself. Default transferred operational control. The financial instrument and the strategic outcome were the same instrument. The Hambantota case became so heavily discussed that it began to function as a template for critics of Chinese lending. The proof that debt trap diplomacy, as it was labelled, was the operating logic behind the entire network. Sri Lanka borrowed $1.4 billion from China Merchants Port Holdings and associated entities to develop Hambantota. When debt servicing became unmanageable, the Sri Lankan government agreed in 2017 to a 99-year lease, transferring port operations to a Chinese state-linked firm. The parallels to 19th century colonial port concessions were drawn immediately and loudly. That counter-argument, that what China built is a debt trap architecture dressed as development finance, is the strongest version of the critical case, and it deserves to be stated at full strength before it is examined further. The evidence for it is not manufactured. Hambantota happened. The loan terms in Djibouti, where China Merchants Port holds a significant stake in the Durale container terminal, adjacent to China's only acknowledged foreign military base, created a debt structure with similar leverage properties. A 2018 report from the Centre for Global Development identified 23 countries it assessed as potentially at risk of debt distress from Chinese infrastructure lending, 8 of which it identified as carrying significant risk of Chinese leverage over strategic assets. Those are real documents, real cases, real leverage. The debt trap framing is not invented. The question is whether it is the mechanism, the operating logic, or whether it is a consequence that emerged from a different primary logic, which the mechanism itself reveals if you follow it past the cases that confirmed the hypothesis. What the debt trap framing does not account for is the selection pattern. If the operating logic were primarily financial extraction, lend, create distress, acquire, you would expect the target selection to follow debtor vulnerability. Poorest countries, weakest fiscal positions, highest likelihood of default. But the port acquisitions that fit the 2004 document's list of strategic maritime nodes were not concentrated in the most financially fragile states. They were concentrated in the most geographically significant ones. Piraeus is not a vulnerable debtor play. It is the Mediterranean's largest container port and the gateway to southeastern Europe's rail network. Antwerp is not a distressed economy. It is the second largest port in Europe by cargo volume. The selection was geographic before it was financial. The financing was the mechanism of acquisition, not the logic of selection. Which is a quiet way of saying something loud. The debt trap framing, even where it is accurate about outcomes, misidentifies what was being built. A debt trap is a financial instrument. What the 2004 document described and what the acquisition pattern between 2004 and 2015 reflected was not a lending strategy with strategic side effects. It was a geographic strategy with a lending mechanism attached. The counter-argument that this was opportunistic finance rather than coordinated architecture rests on the assumption that coordination at that scale, sustained across 3 successive Chinese administrations, is unlikely without visible central direction. That assumption is about to encounter the detail introduced earlier, the one that has been sitting in the sequence without its full weight attached. The 2004 Medium and Long-Term Plan for Comprehensive Transportation Network Development named 23 strategic maritime nodes. By 2015, Chinese entities had operational presence in 19 of them. That figure was introduced earlier as a data point in a sequence. It returns now as something more specific. Because the 4 locations where presence had not yet been established by 2015 were not gaps in the strategy. They were the locations where Western regulatory or political resistance had successfully blocked acquisition attempts. And in 3 of the 4 cases, that resistance was eventually overcome through a second approach using a different Chinese entity than the one that had been blocked the first time. The counter-argument from Part 2, that this was opportunistic finance rather than coordinated architecture, that the strategic outcomes were consequences rather than objectives, cannot account for that substitution pattern. Opportunistic lending does not, when blocked in a location, return through a different vehicle to the same location. Opportunistic lending moves to the next available opportunity. What returned to the same location through a different entity after regulatory resistance had been mapped is something that was following a list. The 2004 document was not a Belt and Road precursor in the way that framing usually implies, a draft version of a later, more ambitious policy. It predated Belt and Road by 9 years, survived the transition from Hu Jintao's administration to Xi Jinping's without revision to its core location list, and its 23 nodes appear in the acquisition record with a fidelity that is too precise to be coincidental. When 3 successive administrations, across 9 years of pre-announcement activity, acquire operational presence in 19 of 23 locations specified in a single planning document, the hypothesis that this was uncoordinated is not a serious hypothesis. What I keep coming back to is this. The Western policy response treated Belt and Road as the starting point of the problem and designed its countermeasures accordingly. The Build Back Better World initiative, announced by the G7 in 2021, was framed explicitly as an alternative to Belt and Road. The EU's Global Gateway, launched the same year with a €300 billion commitment, used almost identical framing. Both programs were designed to offer developing countries an alternative to Chinese infrastructure finance, starting from 2021. The architecture they were responding to had been under construction since 2004. The countermeasures arrived 17 years after the strategy they were countering had already identified its targets and begun acquiring them. The dismantling of the counterargument here is not that debt trap dynamics do not exist. In specific cases, documented above, they do. It is that the debt trap framing caused the Western policy response to focus on the financial instrument rather than the geographic outcome. You cannot build an alternative lending facility and recover the operational control of Piraeus. You cannot offer better loan terms and relocate Hambantota away from the Indian Ocean shipping lane it sits beside. The financial competition that G7 programs entered was real. It was also, by the time it was entered, beside the point. The geographic positions were already held, and a port concession, once granted, runs for decades. Hambantota's lease runs to 2116. The financial instrument was temporary leverage. The geographic outcome is a generational one. There is a phrase that appears in Chinese strategic planning literature, not in Belt and Road documents, which are carefully written for international consumption, but in the academic and think tank literature that informs State Council policy, translated variously as comprehensive national power or integrated national strength. The concept treats military capacity, economic weight, technological capability, and geographic position as components of a single index. Port presence in this framework is not a trade asset. It is a component of comprehensive national power, measurable, accumulable, and not easily reversed once established. The 2004 document used the phrase strategic maritime nodes. The acquisition record shows 19 of 23 nodes reached by 2015, with 3 of the 4 remaining ones approached a second time through different entities after initial resistance. What that sequence tells you is not that China built a port network. It tells you that a list was made, a mechanism was designed to work through it, and the list was followed with enough consistency across enough years and enough administrations that the word strategy is not strong enough for what it actually was. The honest conclusion here is that the world's most consequential infrastructure project was completed in its essential architecture before most of the institutions tasked with responding to it had identified it as a project at all. The 95 ports are not the ambition. They are the result of an ambition that was stated in 2004 pursued through 3 administrations, and finished in its first-order geographic objectives before the G7 announced a competing framework in 2021. What was announced in 2021 was not a response to something in progress. It was a response to something already done. The opening question was when the starting point actually was. The answer the sequence produces is 2004. Not 2013, not 2008, not the moment any particular port acquisition made headlines. The Belt and Road announcement in Astana was not the beginning of the strategy. It was the moment the strategy acquired a name, which is a different thing. Naming something that already exists is not the same as starting it. And the 17-year gap between the 2004 document and the 2021 Western response is not a gap in Western awareness exactly. Hambantota generated significant coverage in 2017. Piraeus generated significant coverage earlier than that. The gap is between awareness of individual acquisitions and recognition of the list those acquisitions were working through. That distinction between noticing the moves and reading the game is where the strategic failure actually lives. Individual port deals were analysed as commercial transactions, development finance decisions, bilateral relationship management. The OECD's 2019 review of Chinese overseas investment categorised port acquisitions primarily under infrastructure finance, rather than strategic asset accumulation. The European Commission's Foreign Investment Screening Regulation, which created the first EU-level mechanism for reviewing acquisitions on security grounds, came into full effect in October 2020, 16 years after the document that was driving the acquisitions it was designed to screen. Screening mechanisms built for individual transactions do not catch a coordinated list. They were not designed for what they were facing. What this produces going forward is already visible in the data. The 4 locations from the 2004 document where acquisition attempts were blocked or incomplete, 2 in the Indo-Pacific, 1 in West Africa, 1 in the Eastern Mediterranean, have each seen renewed activity since 2022, following the same substitution pattern observed earlier. Different entity, same location, remapped approach based on where the initial resistance came from. The list, in other words, is still being worked. The G7 counter-programming has generated commitment announcements and financing frameworks. It has not yet generated the operational port presence in the locations that matter. Commitments and presence are not the same thing. China's advantage in this competition is not financial. Western capital markets are deeper. The advantage is that one side has been executing against a specific geographic list for 20 years, and the other side is still, in most of the locations that matter, at the commitment stage. The last thing worth saying about Piraeus, the port that opened this sequence, signed in 2008, fully acquired by COSCO in 2016, is that it was almost blocked. The Greek parliament voted against the initial concession in 2008. The deal proceeded anyway through a different authorisation pathway. When the full acquisition came up for parliamentary review in 2016, it passed. By then, Piraeus had become the fastest growing container port in the world under COSCO management, which made the political economy of blocking the completion very different from what it had been 8 years earlier. The first approach mapped the resistance. The second approach arrived after the intervening years had changed the calculation. That is not opportunism. That is patience applied to a plan. The map that opened this video, 95 ports, 53 countries, every major choke point, does not look the same once you know it was drawn in 2004. It looks less like an expansion and more like a delivery. The question for the next decade is not whether the architecture can be matched. It probably cannot, not in the locations that matter, not at the pace that would change the underlying geography. The question is whether the institutions now designing responses have correctly identified what they are actually responding to, or whether they are still, as they were in 2013 and again in 2017 and again in 2021, naming something that has already moved past the name. If this sequence changed how you read the standard coverage of this subject, the channel has several others that run the same method across different terrain. Share this one with anyone still working from the 2013 start date.